everyone. We are now in week 4 of our Human Growth and Development course. And this week, our focus is going to be on middle childhood, which is the developmental period between ages 6 and 11. There's lots of interesting things that happen in development in this period. So let me first just review the things we're going to cover this week. And then I'll focus on the topic for the rest of the video, which is parenting in middle childhood. So the first thing we're going to cover is cognition and learning in middle childhood. We're also going to be focusing some on special needs children and special education during middle childhood. So I'm sure you can tell that this course is based on what we call normative development. For us to understand when development goes awry, we need to have a really strong baseline of what typical development looks like. And that is what we spend the majority of this course focusing on. But we will delve into the topic of special needs children a bit this week. We also are going to talk some about video games and the effects of playing video games on development. If children are going to play video games, this period is usually when they're going to get that started, and so it's an appropriate time for us to look at that research a little bit. We're also going to be talking about the concepts of self-concept, self-esteem, and resilience in middle childhood. I feel like I could teach an entire course on resilience. It is so interesting to understand what it is about certain children who can go through traumatic experiences and difficult life circumstances and come out on the other side relatively unscathed, whereas other children face the consequences of those things well into adulthood. So there's a lot of research on resilience, and we'll cover some of that this week. You're also going to learn about moral reasoning in middle childhood. So morality is one of those things that's really tied to lots of other developmental constructs. So, for example, when you think about morality, it's tied to cognition and where children are at with their ability to think through different situations in certain ways. It's also very related to emotional development. So, can children take another person's perspective? Have they develop empathy? All of those things really contribute to one's moral development. And then finally, we're going to focus on family structures and functions and how that relates to well-being in middle childhood. And that's where we're going to spend the rest of this video. We had talked about at the beginning of the course Urie Bronfenbrenner and his model that talks about the fact that development does not occur in a vacuum, and all of the contexts that we experience really do impact how we develop. And in middle childhood, the family is by far the most important context for development. For example, when we talked about infancy, we talked some about the attachment relationship and how important that is in predicting relationships well into adulthood. So it's probably no surprise that there's been a lot of research in middle childhood that focuses on parenting. If you go into a bookstore, there are just bookshelves full of books written from author after author that talk about what it means to be a good parent. I myself feel overwhelmed by some of that stuff, knowing how to navigate and figure out what is true and what is based in research and what do I need to adopt and ascribe into my own parenting. So I'm going to be just laying some of the groundwork about the research that's been done on parenting in middle childhood to help give you just a foundation for this really important topic. So one of the key researchers in this area is named Diana Baumrind. And if you've ever taken a psychology class before or a developmental class before, you've probably heard about her and her research. She developed 4 different types of parenting that they have found through many different studies over decades have been very predictive of child well-being. So let me just quickly go through each of these types of parenting that she talks about, as well as some of the outcomes that are associated with these types of parenting. So the first is called authoritative parenting. This is considered the gold standard of parenting. Authoritative parents have both high standards for their children, but they also demonstrate lots of warmth in enforcing those standards. So they follow through, but they're also flexible, compassionate. They offer their children forgiveness and grace when they don't meet standards. These parents tend to see themselves as guides for their children, not as friends or authorities. Children who are parented by authoritative parents tend to be successful, happy, articulate, well-liked, and generous in adulthood. So definitely the gold standard. The next type of parenting is called authoritarian parenting. Now, these parents tend to have very high standards, like authoritative parents, but they are not warm, kind, and compassionate with their children. So there's very strict punishment if children misbehave. There's no discussion or negotiation with children. Emotions are not something that are talked about much in these families. These children do tend to be obedient, quiet, but they also tend to be depressed. They tend to feel guilty quickly, and they do tend to rebel more than other adolescents because of this family dynamic in their home. The third type of parenting is called indulgent parenting. Another term that's often used is permissive parenting. So again, thinking about this idea of standards and warmth, these parents have very low standards but very high warmth. These parents typically do not discipline their children. They do not provide much guidance or control. These children tend to lack self-control and emotional regulation because they're not getting that high standard being set by their parents. And this ends up impacting their ability to form relationships long term. They also are more likely to stay dependent on their parents in their 20s, whereas authoritative kids tend to be more able to be launched into adulthood. And then the last type of parenting is neglectful or uninvolved. So these parents tend to have low standards and also low warmth. They are just not present. Often these parents have other significant issues going on in their life, their own traumas and hardships that they're dealing with. And these children bear the effects of that and tend to be immature, sad, lonely, and at risk for injury and abuse. So again, this is just the very, very basic parenting research in middle childhood. There's lots of critiques of this research, and there's lots of gaps of these styles to see whether they really have the same implications for all different groups, all different age groups, all different cultural groups. There's a really interesting write-up in your textbook that I want to point you to that talks about culture and parenting and how much our culture shapes how we approach our parenting. However, this is a really helpful style when you're initially talking about parenting to understand how parents interact with their children and what the influence of that is for their kids. The second aspect of parenting that I want to spend a minute talking to you about is something called co-parenting. Co-parenting just refers to the degree to which parents work as a team with respect to children. So co-parenting is something that most of us understand intuitively. It's often easy if you're around two parents and a child to see how well they're co-parenting. It's important to spend time dissecting this construct though, because they find that the quality of the co-parenting relationship has a lot of implications for how children are developing and growing and changing and thriving in middle childhood. When we think about parenting in most cultures across the world, there's many different types of families. We know that, but most families contain more than one parenting figure. So when you think about it that way, parenting in and of itself is inherently co-parenting. And it's also important to note that people can co-parent even if they're not the biological parents of a child. So, for example, a mother and a grandmother can co-parent a child and have a co-parenting relationship that this research that I'm going to cover extends to. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that it is not always the two married biological parents who are in the co-parenting relationship. Co-parenting is something that we call, it is a multidimensional construct, meaning that it's made up of different parts. So there's one co-parenting researcher named Mark Feinberg, he's at Penn State, who put forth a model of co-parenting that has 4 different dimensions. So I'm just going to review those quickly, and then I'm going to talk about some of the research that points to how important co-parenting is to child development in middle childhood. So the first thing that he talks about with respect to co-parenting is what we call support versus undermining of the co-parenting role. So this refers to parents who affirm each other's competency as parents, respect each other's contributions, and importantly, uphold each other's parenting decisions. So, I mean, this happened to my husband and I yesterday. Now we have a little one who just turned 3, and we were both in the same room, and she looked at me and she asked me for a snack, and I said no. And then she went to her dad and said, "Can I have a snack?" Now, we were in the same room, and he knew what my response was, so of course he was going to back me up. But that idea of having parents who support each other's parenting decisions, whether it's something small like a snack or something more significant later on as they grow, it is reflected in this part of co-parenting. The second part is child rearing agreement. So this component of co-parenting represents the degree to which parents agree on different aspects of parenting, such as safety, discipline, education, religion, religious values, how that's going to be played out in a family. The more discrepancy there is about beliefs on these topics, the harder it is to successfully co-parent. Now, one thing I wanted to point out about child rearing agreement is that this is something that will change over the course of parenting. So I can remember dear friends of ours, they're actually the pastor who married my husband and I, talked about, they actually have 9 children, but at the point we were like doing life with them, they had 3 biological kids, and the oldest one was entering adolescence and was overweight. And the pastor's wife, Kim, talked to me about how much her and her husband were not on the same page with knowing what to do with that. And it was the first time in their parenting that they were ever at a disagreement in what to do about this specific thing that they were facing with their son. And so even if you might disagree in different seasons of parenting about different topics, it's something that changes over the course of a co-parenting relationship. The third thing, part of co-parenting, is division of labor. So this reflects how parents divide up the work related to daily routines, childcare, and household tasks. Families need a balance of structure and flexibility to make this work. Now, one thing that's interesting with division of labor, sometimes you'll see studies that look back over history and how much men versus women did with respect to housework and child rearing. And there's a lot of talk about how, while lots of things have changed in the past 30, 40 years, women still do a lot more of the housework than men do. And one thing that I want to point out with this construct, specifically with co-parenting, is that it's not so much an issue of equity. So you can have a 50-50 distribution of division of labor, and the 2 people in the marriage are really unhappy with that division. Or you can have an 80-20 split where one of the parents does 80%, another parent does 20%, and both of them are very satisfied with that. So it's not an issue of trying to get everything equal. It has to do with the satisfaction of the people with respect to how the labor is divided around child rearing. The final aspect of co-parenting is called joint family management, and that has 3 different components. The first has to do with conflict, so it's just the degree to which children are exposed to interparental conflict around parenting issues. Again, conflict is normal, it is healthy. There's actually research that I know of in adolescence that says that if parents aren't having conflict with their adolescents, it's actually a sign that something is wrong. Conflict in and of itself is not wrong. It's how you work through it and how you come to a resolution. And the same is true here for co-parenting conflict. The second is coalitions. So this has to do with when children are pulled by one parent or another in the midst of a conflict, so that child kind of feels like they need to take sides. And this obviously makes kids feel like they're caught in the middle. So to what degree are coalitions being formed in the co-parenting relationship? And the last has to do with balance. So balance refers to the degree to which both parents are interacting with the child. Are both parents engaged? If so, to what degree? And again, it's not necessarily an issue of equal engagement, but just whether or not everyone is involved in a way that is satisfying to everyone involved. So that is a basic framework for co-parenting. Now, how do you assess co-parenting in the research, right? There's lots of different ways that researchers go about trying to assess these constructs. I worked on a research study in graduate school on co-parenting, and we watched videos of parents in a lab with a child where they were given a task and they had to help the child work through it. And we analyzed how they did this over 10 minutes to understand the co-parenting relationship. So that's one way. Another way is just to ask parents about it. So there's multiple questionnaires that have been developed to assess co-parenting. So here's a few questions that are on one co-parenting measure, just to give you a sense of how we as researchers break this construct down. So for example, people would rate on a scale from 1 not at all to 5, almost always, questions like, my co-parent and I have different rules regarding food, chores, bedtime, and homework. My co-parent believes that I'm a good parent. My co-parent tries to get our children to take sides when we argue. Or my co-parent fills me in on what's happened during our children's day. So there's probably about 20 questions parents would answer like that with respect to gauging their own co-parenting relationship. So now we have the so what question. Why does this matter? Is co-parenting important? And there is a lot of research that shows that the quality of the co-parenting relationship is linked to all sorts of outcomes for children. For example, children who live with parents who do not have a successful co-parenting relationship have more behavior problems than those whose parents are in greater accord. They find that hostility between co-parents in a child's infancy then predicts preschool teachers' ratings of their aggression, anxiety, competitiveness, and problem behavior 4 years later. Children who have a positive co-parenting relationship tend to have better self-regulation and positive youth development in middle childhood than children who don't. So there's all sorts of research that really point to the importance of this co-parenting relationship in middle childhood. So I've gone on for a long time. I'm going to end here. As always, please reach out to me or your instructor if you have any other questions as you go through the material this week. Thanks.